The date is August 7th, 1942. 16,000 Marines are waist-deep in surf, pushing toward an island most of them couldn't find on a map a week ago. Guadalcanal. The name sounds exotic. The reality is anything but. It's a fever dream of jungle and heat, a steaming slab of green hell in the middle of the Pacific, and every man wading toward that beach has been told the same thing. Take the airfield. Simple mission, clean objective. They storm the beach expecting a bloodbath. Instead, they get something worse. Silence. The Japanese are gone, melted into the jungle, leaving behind an airfield that isn't really an airfield at all. It's a scar in the earth, a strip of dirt that turns to concrete when the sun bakes it and transforms into something resembling chocolate soup when the rains come. And the rains always come. The Marines stand there, boots sinking, staring at this muddy runway. And they begin to understand something the brass back in Washington hasn't told them. They haven't captured an asset. They've inherited a death sentence. Because in the Pacific, you don't win by holding dirt. You win by owning the sky above it. And you can't own the sky without aircraft. And aircraft need runways that don't swallow them whole. Within 48 hours, Japanese bombers return. Not to take the island back, but to make sure it stays useless. They pound Henderson Field. That's what the Marines named it, after a pilot who died at Midway. And every bomb that hits mud is a bomb that doesn't need to. The real enemy isn't the explosives, it's the ground itself. After every rainstorm, Wildcat fighters sink up to their bellies. Mechanics watch, helpless, as landing gear just disappears into the muck like the earth is hungry. One pilot tries to intercept an incoming raid. His wheels carve trenches 4 feet deep before his plane even budges. He never gets airborne. The bombers he was supposed to stop arrive 20 minutes later and unload without opposition. Engineers try crushed coral. It washes away. They try steel plates. They warp in the heat. They try everything in the manual, and the manual keeps failing them. By mid-August, Henderson Field is operational maybe 3 days out of 7. On the other days, the Marines on the ground are naked. No air cover means Japanese cruisers can sail right up and shell them at leisure. No air cover means enemy reinforcements land under cover of darkness, fresh and ready. The math is ugly and unforgiving. Without a working runway, Guadalcanal falls. If Guadalcanal falls, the entire Pacific offensive stalls for a year. Maybe longer, maybe forever. 7,000 miles away, in an office in Washington, a desperate message lands on a desk. It's from the Pacific, from the men sinking into the mud. And it says the same thing every message has been saying for weeks. We need a solution. And we needed it yesterday. The Army Corps of Engineers isn't starting from zero. They've been circling this problem since before Pearl Harbor even happened. Running field tests everywhere from Louisiana bayous to Alaskan permafrost, trying to crack the code of how you build a runway on ground that refuses to cooperate. But every attempt has ended the same way, in failure. And now those failures aren't abstract. They're watching men die in real time because the ground won't hold. The first real attempt came early in 1941. They called it square mesh track, welded steel bars arranged in a grid, like chain-link fence made from rebar. The concept made sense on paper. Distribute the weight across a wider surface. Spread the load. They laid it down at Langley Field in Virginia, confident they'd solved it. Then they rolled a B-17 across it. 30 tons of bomber. The mesh folded like tinfoil. Collapsed under the pressure like it was made of paper. The steel simply wasn't thick enough to handle the brutal, concentrated force of landing gear slamming down. But if they made it thicker, it became so heavy you'd need an entire cargo ship just to haul enough mesh for one runway. Dead end. Then came spring of 1941 and the Hessian Mat experiments. British engineers had reported modest success in North Africa, using burlap fabric soaked in asphalt for temporary roads. The Americans figured if it worked for trucks, why not for fighters? They soaked thousands of yards of heavy jute in boiling asphalt, laid it across soft soil at Wright Field in Ohio, and started landing tests with P-40s. The first landing was beautiful. The second created ruts. By the 10th, the fabric was shredded, torn completely apart. and chunks of asphalt-soaked burlap were jamming up landing gear. They scrapped the whole idea by June. Coral seemed more promising. In the summer of 1941, engineers built test runways using crushed coral mixed with volcanic rock, materials you could find on almost any Pacific island. They compacted it with steamrollers until it felt like concrete. For 3 weeks it held. Perfectly. Aircraft landed and took off without issue. Then the rain came. Not a drizzle. A tropical storm that dumped 6 inches in 2 hours. The runway dissolved into slurry. Engineers stood there, watching the surface develop gullies deep enough to hide a man. Once coral breaks down wet, you can't recompact it. You have to rebuild from scratch. Another failure. Pierced steel planking came closer to working than anything else. The British had developed it for rapid road construction. Flat steel plates, about 10 feet long, with holes punched through to reduce weight and improve traction. The US military started testing it at Bowling Field in August of 1941. Installation was fast. You could essentially shingle a runway in days instead of months. But it had a fatal flaw. Steel expands when it heats up, and under equatorial sun, those plates buckled and warped, creating ridges sharp enough to shear off landing gear on contact. Pilots said landing on warped steel felt like touching down on a washboard at 80 miles an hour. Every test ended the same way. Close, but not good enough. By autumn of 1941, the engineering teams were out of ideas and running out of time. Then, December 7th changed everything. Pearl Harbor wasn't just an attack. It was a revelation. The Pacific Theater was going to demand solutions that didn't exist yet. Technologies nobody had invented. Innovations born out of sheer desperation. The Corps of Engineers issued an urgent contract to American steel manufacturers. The requirements sounded impossible. We need a runway surface that installs in days, supports aircraft up to 50,000 pounds, works equally well in mud and on coral, survives tropical heat without warping, and is light enough to ship across an ocean on vessels already overloaded with tanks and ammunition. Oh, and we need it now. Carnegie, Illinois, Steel Corporation in Pittsburgh took the contract. Their lead engineer was a man named James Marston. He looked at every failure, every collapsed test, every warped plate and sunken mesh, and he realized something nobody else had seen. Everyone had been trying to create a surface that mimicked concrete or compacted earth. They were fighting the mud, trying to beat it into submission. Marston's insight was simpler, almost obvious once you saw it. Don't fight the mud. Float on top of it. He started sketching something that looked less like a road and more like a flexible metal carpet. By February 1942, his team had a prototype ready. It was a steel plank, 10 feet long, 15 inches wide, but everything else about it was different. The thickness was 3/16 of an inch, high-strength steel, thick enough to resist buckling under massive loads, but thin enough that each plank weighed only 66 pounds, heavy enough to stay in place, light enough that 2 exhausted men could wrestle it into position without machinery. Marston's team punched rows of holes through the entire surface. It looked like an industrial cheese grater, but those holes weren't decorative. Each one served 3 purposes. First, they reduced weight by roughly 30%. Second, they allowed water to drain straight through instead of pooling on the surface. Third, they created edges that gave aircraft tires something to grip, something to bite into. But the real genius was in the edges of each plank. Both long sides had interlocking features that Marston's engineers had spent months perfecting through trial and error. One edge had a raised lip with a hook that curved upward. The opposite edge had a matching channel. When you laid 2 planks side by side, that hook slid into the channel and locked. Not with bolts, not with welds, just mechanical pressure. Pure physics. The connection was strong enough that a 50,000-pound aircraft could roll across the seam without separating the planks, but flexible enough that the entire mat could bend and conform to uneven ground without breaking apart. The short ends had a different system, a simple overlapping joint where one plank's end slid beneath the next. This created a continuous surface running the length of a runway, with no gaps wide enough to catch a wheel. And here's the beautiful part. As weight pressed down, the planks actually locked tighter together rather than spreading apart. The more stress you applied, the stronger the connection became. In March 1942, the Army ran tests at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana. They chose that location deliberately. The soil there was notorious, almost as bad as Pacific mud. Engineers laid down 1,200 square feet of Marston's interlocking planks directly on top of unprepared, swampy ground. No foundation, no preparation, just planks on mud. They rolled a fully loaded B-17 across it. The mat flexed. You could actually see it ripple as the weight passed over. Watch the wave of compression move through the steel. But it held. They ran 50 takeoffs and landings over 3 days. The mat developed surface scratches but zero structural failures. When they pulled up a section to inspect what was happening underneath, the ground had compressed about 2 inches, but the interlocking system had distributed that compression evenly across the entire surface. No stress fractures, no separation at the seams, no failures. The military ordered 60 million square feet immediately. Understanding why these mats worked requires understanding the physics of what happens when 30 tons of metal slams into soft earth at 100 miles an hour. The problem isn't the total weight, it's how that weight concentrates. A B-25 Mitchell bomber weighs around 35,000 pounds fully loaded, but all that weight funnels down through 2 main landing gear struts and a tail wheel. Each main gear has 2 tires. That means you're concentrating 35,000 pounds onto roughly 4 square feet of contact area. Nearly 9,000 pounds per square foot, hitting the ground every single time a plane lands. Soft soil can typically support maybe 300 pounds per square foot before it starts giving way. The math doesn't need explanation. Marston Mat solved this through cascading load distribution. When a landing gear wheel touched down on one plank, that plank didn't act alone. The interlocking hooks and channels meant force transmitted immediately to the 4 adjacent planks. 2 on each side, 1 in front, 1 behind. Those planks shared the load with their neighbors. It cascaded outward like ripples in water. By the time that 9,000 pounds per square foot reached the actual ground underneath, it had been spread across roughly 100 square feet of mat surface. The ground only saw about 90 pounds per square foot. Well, within the bearing capacity of even terrible soil, the flexibility was just as critical as the strength. Concrete runways are rigid, which works beautifully on solid foundations, but fails catastrophically on soft ground. When one section of concrete sinks even slightly lower than surrounding areas, the rigid slab cracks. Once it cracks, water infiltrates. Then the whole thing deteriorates rapidly, breaking apart like rotted wood. Marston Mat didn't crack because it wasn't trying to be rigid. Each plank could move independently by fractions of an inch while still maintaining that interlocking connection. The entire runway surface essentially floated on the ground like a giant steel raft, conforming to whatever settling or shifting happened underneath without breaking apart. The system breathed. It adapted. It survived. The holes punched through each plank did more than reduce weight and drain water. They created what engineers call a semi-permeable surface. When rain came, and in the Pacific it rained with biblical intensity, water didn't pool on top, creating hydroplaning hazards. It drained straight through the holes, but the holes were only about 2 inches in diameter, which meant aircraft tires, which were much wider, still had plenty of solid steel to grip. The tire saw effectively solid surface. Water saw a drain. It was elegant in its simplicity. Testing at Wright Field in April 1942 showed that water cleared from a Marston Mat runway 6 times faster than from solid surfaces. The interlocking edges also solved a problem nobody had anticipated. Bomb damage repair. When a Japanese bomber put a crater in your runway, you couldn't patch Marston Mat the way you'd patch concrete. You had to replace entire sections, but because the planks interlocked without welding or bolting, repair crews could simply unlock the damaged planks, slide them out, and drop new ones into place. At Henderson Field, engineers timed this process obsessively. A bomb crater that destroyed a 20-foot section of runway could could be fully repaired and operational again in under 40 minutes. That wasn't including filling the crater itself. Just replacing the mat surface. Compare that to concrete, where a similar repair might take days and require specialized equipment to pour and cure new material. The system's simplicity meant training requirements were minimal. You didn't need specialized engineers to install Marston Mat. You just needed men who could follow a pattern and work fast under pressure. Henderson Field, August 17, 1942. The first shipment arrives aboard cargo ships that had to run a gauntlet of Japanese submarines just to get there. Naval Construction Battalion personnel, the Seabees, unload 36 tons of steel planking onto the beach while 0 fighters strafe the shoreline. They're working against a deadline that isn't measured in days or even hours. It's measured in the minutes before the next bombing raid. Most of these Seabees had never seen this material before. A few months ago, they were civilian construction workers, carpenters, steel workers, equipment operators pulled from jobs building highways and bridges across America. Now they're in a combat zone assembling a runway from scratch while people are actively trying to kill them. The first thing they realize is that 66 pounds per plank sounds manageable until you're carrying those planks hundreds of yards in 100-degree heat with 90% humidity. Sweat doesn't evaporate. It just accumulates. Every breath feels like drowning. They develop a rhythm born of pure necessity. 2-man teams grab planks from stockpiles and haul them to the runway edge. A third man acts as guide, positioning each plank so the interlocking edges line up properly. The first row goes down relatively easy. They're just laying planks side by side on cleared ground, learning the feel of it. But every subsequent row requires that hook and channel connection. The technique they figure out through trial and error. Tilt the new plank at a slight angle. Slide the hook under the channel of the already placed plank, then drop it flat. When it seats properly, you hear a metallic click. That click becomes the most satisfying sound these men know. It means it's locked. It means they can move to the next one. It means they're one plank closer to survival. The work happens in frantic bursts between air raids. Japanese bombers hit Henderson Field almost daily, sometimes twice a day. The Seabees learn to watch for spotters. A single reconnaissance plane circling overhead means bombers are maybe an hour behind. When the call goes out, everyone drops their tools and runs for foxholes. The bombers come over in tight formation, drop their loads, and leave. The Seabees wait 10 minutes for unexploded ordnance to cook off or get cleared. Then they're back on the runway, continuing exactly where they stopped. If a bomb hits the section they've already completed, they unlock the damaged planks and replace them like changing tiles. If it hits a section they haven't reached yet, they fill the crater with coral and keep laying mat right over it. No delays, no excuses. August 20th. 3 days after the first mat arrived, a section of runway 200 feet long and 75 feet wide is operational. It's not a full runway. Henderson Field will eventually need 5,000 feet to handle bombers safely. But it's enough for fighters. Enough to start hitting back. That afternoon, 19 Wildcat fighters and 12 Dauntless dive bombers fly in from the carrier Enterprise. These aircraft, designated VMF-223 and VMSB-232, become the famed Cactus Air Force, named after Guadalcanal's radio call sign. They're landing on a surface that didn't exist 72 hours earlier. The pilots report that landing on Marston Mat feels different from concrete or compacted earth. There's a slight give to it, a flex you can feel through the landing gear. Some describe it as landing on a firm trampoline. That flexibility actually makes it more forgiving. Planes coming in too hard don't bounce as violently because the mat absorbs some of the impact energy. It gives just enough. By September 5th, 1942, Henderson Field has a complete Marston Mat runway. 5,200 feet long, 150 feet wide. Total installation time, including delays from air raids, artillery fire, tropical storms, and pure exhaustion, 19 days. Traditional concrete construction would have required at least 3 months under ideal conditions. And nothing about Guadalcanal qualified as ideal. Guadalcanal proved the concept, But what happens next shows the true strategic value of being able to build infrastructure faster than your enemy thinks possible. By early 1943, the US military is planning an island-hopping campaign across the Pacific that will eventually cover 7,000 miles from the Solomons to the Japanese home islands. Every single one of those islands will need an operational airfield, and they'll need it immediately. The Japanese strategy depends on turning each island into a fortress that takes months to capture and months more to make useful. Marston Mat collapses that timeline entirely. February 1943, Russell Islands. The Marines land expecting heavy resistance. Instead, they find the Japanese have evacuated during the night. Within 60 hours of the first troops hitting the beach, Seabees have a fully operational fighter strip laid with Marston Mat. The speed is so shocking that when Admiral William Halsey flies in to inspect it, he asked the battalion commander if they started building before the island was actually secured. They hadn't. They'd just gotten that efficient, that good. The Russell Islands airfield immediately provides air cover for the next leap up the Solomon chain, cutting what would have been weeks of vulnerability down to days. Munda Point on New Georgia Island, August 1943. This one's different because the Japanese are still there, dug into reinforced bunkers overlooking the airfield site. The Seabees lay Marston Mat while under direct fire. They develop tactics that sound suicidal but somehow work through sheer audacity. Half the battalion lays planks, while the other half provides covering fire with rifles and machine guns. Its construction work is combat operation. Casualties are significant. 14 men killed, 47 wounded. But the runway is operational in 11 days. Marine Corsair fighters start flying missions from Munda, while Japanese snipers are still being cleared from the jungle perimeter. The airfield becomes operational before the battle is even technically over. November 1943. Bougainville. This is where the military starts experimenting with prefabrication, pushing the concept further. Instead of laying individual planks, engineers back in Australia start pre-assembling sections of Marston Mat into massive panels measuring 50 feet by 15 feet. These giant sections get loaded onto LSTs, landing ship tanks, and transported intact. When the LSTs beach at Bougainville, cranes lift these pre-assembled sections directly onto prepared ground like laying down enormous tiles. A runway that would have taken 2 weeks to install plank by plank goes down in 4 days. By December, Bougainville has 3 complete Marston Mat runways, forming a triangle pattern that allows simultaneous takeoffs and landings regardless of wind direction. They've turned a jungle island into a fully operational airbase in less time than it takes to plan a concrete runway. The production numbers tell the story of how central this technology became to the entire war effort. In 1942, Carnegie, Illinois, and 9 other steel manufacturers produced 8 million square feet of Marston Mat. In 1943, production hits 40 million square feet. By 1944, it's 60 million square feet annually. That's enough to build a runway from New York to Philadelphia if you laid it end to end. The military is using so much Marston Mat that it creates a steel shortage for other war programs. Tank production gets temporarily reduced because the furnaces are prioritized for runway matting. They're literally choosing runways over tanks because runways enable everything else. January 1945. Lingayen Gulf in the Philippines. This operation uses Marston Mat in a way nobody originally intended. Engineers lay it across sandy beaches to create instant piers and roadways for supply trucks. They discover the mat works just as well for distributing wheeled vehicle loads as it does for aircraft. Supply convoys that would normally bog down in beach sand can now drive directly from landing craft to supply dumps inland. The mat becomes universal infrastructure. It solves problems it wasn't even designed to solve. February 1945, Iwo Jima. This might be the most famous Marston Mat installation of the war, though few people recognize it. The volcanic ash on Iwo Jima is so fine and loose, it's like trying to build on powdered sugar. Concrete won't cure properly because the ash contaminates the mix. Compacted earth is impossible because there is no earth. Just ash, miles of it. Marston Mat becomes the only viable option. Seabees lay it across all 3 airfields on the island, while the battle for Mount Suribachi is still raging a mile away. They can hear the fighting. They can see the tracers at night, but they keep laying planks because without those runways, the Marines fighting up that volcano have no air support, no medevac, no chance. The war ends in August 1945. Military planners assume Marston Mat will be obsolete within months. Peacetime means you can take your time building proper concrete runways. Do it right. The steel gets stockpiled at depots across the Pacific. Thousands of tons sitting in warehouses waiting to be scrapped or sold off as surplus. Then, June 25, 1950 happens. North Korea invades South Korea. Suddenly, the US military is scrambling to establish air superiority in a theater where infrastructure barely exists. Those stockpiles of Marston Mat get pulled out of storage, dusted off, and shipped to Korea. Korea's terrain is completely different from Pacific Islands. Mountainous, brutal winters, soil that freezes solid. Engineers wonder if mat designed for tropical jungles will work in sub-zero temperatures. They find out quickly. Steel gets brittle in extreme cold, but the interlocking design still holds. The flexibility that made the mat work on soft ground also makes it work on frozen ground. When soil freezes and expands, the mat flexes upward. When it thaws and contracts, the mat settles back down. No cracking, no separation. It adapts. Kimpo Airfield near Seoul becomes the test case. September 1950, the airfield is in ruins. North Korean forces destroyed the concrete runways before retreating. U.S. Air Force engineers lay Marston Mat right over the broken concrete, creating an operational runway in 72 hours. F-86 Sabres start flying combat missions from Kimpo, while concrete repair crews are still jackhammering rubble on adjacent sections. The Korean War sees 38 airfields using Marston Mat. The military starts calling it by a new designation now. PSP, Pierced Steel Planking. The name Marston Mat fades from official use, but the technology stays identical. Same hooks, same channels, same perforated surface, same simple genius. Vietnam, 1965, the mat shows up again. Now it's almost 25 years old. Some of it is literally the same steel planks used on Guadalcanal in 1942. Still functional after 2 decades of use, storage, redeployment. Engineers lay it at places like Da Nang and Bien Hoa, creating dispersal pads for helicopters and expansion areas for existing runways. The Vietnamese climate, monsoons, extreme heat, acidic soil, is almost identical to the Pacific Islands where the mat was originally designed to work. It performs exactly as it did in 1942. No degradation, no failures. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn into peacetime. After Vietnam, Marston Mat finds its way into civilian applications nobody anticipated. Oil companies start using it in Alaska and northern Canada to create temporary roads and drilling pads across permafrost without destroying the fragile tundra. The same weight distribution principles that prevented bombers from sinking into Pacific mud prevent drilling trucks from melting permafrost. Environmental groups actually support its use because it's removable. When drilling operations finish, you can pull up the mat and the tundra recovers naturally. Unlike permanent gravel roads that scar the landscape forever, Marston Mat leaves almost no trace. January 2010, Haiti. A magnitude 7.0 earthquake devastates Port-au-Prince. The international airport's runway is intact, but surrounding infrastructure is destroyed, creating massive bottlenecks for relief flights. Cargo planes full of medical supplies and food are circling overhead with nowhere to unload. The U.S. military airlifts pallets of Marston Mat. They're still manufacturing it, and lays it across damaged taxiways and parking aprons. Within 48 hours, cargo planes can unload and taxi to parking areas that didn't exist 2 days earlier. The technology designed to fight the Japanese Empire in 1942 is now saving earthquake victims in 2010. The principles haven't changed. The need hasn't changed. Modern military forces still maintain stockpiles. The U.S. Air Force calls it AM2 matting now, aluminum membrane version 2. they've switched from steel to aluminum alloys to reduce weight further. But the design is immediately recognizable. Same interlocking edges, same perforated surface, same basic concept Marston sketched in a Pittsburgh office in 1942. The British Royal Air Force uses it. NATO forces deployed it in Afghanistan to expand parking areas at Bagram Airfield. It shows up in disaster zones after typhoons, floods, hurricanes. Anywhere you need instant infrastructure on damaged or unprepared ground. The original Marston Mats are still around too. You can find sections of them repurposed as walkways, bridge decking, even decorative fencing. Some Pacific islands still have operational sections laid during World War II, now weathered and worn, but still functional after 80 years. The steel has turned dark with age and oxidation, but the hooks still lock. The channels still hold. The concept still works. Wars get won by tanks and planes and ships. That's what makes it into the history books and the documentaries. The dramatic battles, the heroic charges, the technological marvels of destruction. But the reality is quieter and less cinematic. Wars get won by the infrastructure nobody sees. The unsexy logistics, the supply chains, the ability to turn a worthless piece of ground into a functional military asset faster than your enemy thinks possible. Marston Mat changed the fundamental equation of how the Pacific War could be fought, and most people have never heard of it. Before these steel planks existed, capturing an island meant committing to months of construction before that island became useful. You'd seize the ground, then you'd wait. Engineers would survey, grade, pour concrete, wait for it to cure. During all that time, your forces were vulnerable. Your newly captured island was essentially just expensive real estate, with a target painted on it. The Japanese understood this perfectly. Their entire defensive strategy counted on each island taking so long to become operational that American momentum would stall, bog down, eventually break. They dig in, make you pay in blood for every yard, and even after you won, you'd be stuck there for months making it functional. Island hopping was supposed to be slow. Marston Mat broke that assumption completely. Suddenly you could land on an island and have operational aircraft flying from it within a week, sometimes within days. That changed everything about how aggressive the American advance could be. Islands that were previously strategic liabilities because they'd take too long to develop became viable targets. The Central Pacific Campaign, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, worked because captured islands could immediately support the next assault instead of becoming expensive pauses in momentum. By the end of 1944, the US military had constructed over 300 airfields in the Pacific Theater. Roughly 220 of those used Marston Mat, either partially or completely. Without it, maybe a third of those airfields get built, and they take 3 times as long. That means fewer forward bases, longer flight distances for bombers, reduced air coverage for naval operations. The entire timeline of the Pacific War potentially shifts by months, maybe a year, maybe more. Look at the bombing campaign against Japan itself. The B-29 Superfortress raids that eventually forced Japanese surrender flew primarily from the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. These islands were captured in summer of 1944. By November 1944, just 5 months later, they were launching massive bombing raids against Tokyo. That's only possible because engineers could lay Marston Mat runways capable of handling the heaviest bomber in the American arsenal in a matter of weeks. Traditional concrete construction would have meant those raids start in mid-1945 at the earliest, completely changing the endgame calculus of the war. There's a broader lesson here about innovation under pressure. Carnegie, Illinois didn't invent some exotic new material or revolutionary manufacturing process. They didn't discover a miracle alloy or develop radical new metallurgy. They just looked at existing steel fabrication techniques and asked better questions. How do you make strength without rigidity? How do you make lightness without weakness? How do you make complexity simple enough that exhausted men under fire can assemble it correctly? The elegance is in the simplicity. Planks that hook together, holes that drain water, steel that flexes without breaking. Nothing revolutionary, Everything essential. Military historians often talk about the Pacific War as an aircraft carrier war, a submarine war, a war of logistics and industrial capacity. All true. But underneath all of that is a war of engineering problems solved under impossible deadlines by people whose names you'll never know. James Marston and his team at Carnegie, Illinois, probably saved more lives and shortened the war more effectively than any single weapon system. Not through destruction, but through construction. They figured out how to turn mud into runways, jungles into airbases, worthless islands into launching platforms. They made the impossible logistically feasible. And in war, logistics is everything. Those perforated steel planks with the simple interlocking edges didn't just build runways. They built victory, one plank at a time.